Hello again all! Welcome back to the Knowledge Tower, where we investigate the science behind the Bionicle legend. In today's investigation, we will be returning once again to the water world of Aquam Magna. Originally known simply as the Endless Ocean, this world was revealed in the later years of Bionicle's run to be one of two moons that orbited the larger world of Bara Magna, a planet of which Aquam Magna itself had once been a part of alongside the other moon of Bota Magna before the cataclysmic events of the Shattering. The true nature of this ocean world had not been part of the story plan from the very beginning, and instead was written in later, meaning that there was no indication of either Bara Magna or Bota Magna's existence in the early years of the Bionicle storyline. From an outsider's perspective, this of course makes sense, given that they had not been conceived of at the time. However, from an in-universe point of view, it's actually very odd. Given the proximity and sheer size of those other worlds, Bara Magna especially, they would absolutely dominate the sky above the islands of Matanui and Voya, and yet the Matoran who lived there seemed completely unaware of their existence. This is especially odd, considering just how much Matoran culture places significance in objects in the sky, particularly on Matanui, where prophecies and whole regions of study were dedicated to celestial bodies such as the Red Star. In this video, we will explore a possible resolution to this discrepancy, one that has some strange implications for both Aquam Magna itself and for how it would be perceived by the beings from those other worlds. There are many possible solutions we could look into to explain this discrepancy. However, the one that I think is the most appropriate is actually fairly simple, and one that you should already be very familiar with. To find it, all you need to do is go outside and look up. Presuming it wasn't cloudy and you looked up at the right time, you would be greeted with the familiar sight of the moon staring back at you with the same pattern of craters you have always known. And it is in that familiar sight where we can find our answer. Our moon rotates upon its axis, just like how the Earth does to create our familiar day and night cycle. However, despite this, we only ever see one side of the moon from our vantage point here on Earth. Why is that? Well, it's all down to the rate of that rotation. The moon takes 29.5 days to complete a single rotation, which just so happens to be the exact same length of time as its orbital period around the Earth. This means that the moon has a 1-to-1 spin-orbit resonance, meaning that for every orbit of the Earth, the moon also performs one full revolution. The result of this is that the same side of the moon is always facing towards the Earth, giving us that familiar, unchanging view that we all know. A good visual demonstration of this can be seen in this graphic here. The animation on the left demonstrates how the moon rotates at the same rate as its orbit, always showing the same side towards the Earth. The animation on the right, meanwhile, shows a non-rotating moon instead, which, as you can see, would show its full surface to the Earth over the course of its orbit. We would also have a similar result if the moon's rotation was faster or slower than its orbital period, with a faster rotation, meaning an earthly observer would see the moon through a whole rotation more than once per orbit, and a slower one, meaning they would see a whole rotation over multiple orbits. This is not some giant cosmic coincidence though, but in fact is the result of a process known as tidal locking. Back when the moon first formed, it spun at a different rate than it does now. However, its interactions with the gravity of the Earth changed this rate of spin over time. Just like how the gravity of the moon causes tides in the ocean here on Earth, the gravity of the Earth causes a sort of tide on the moon too, though in this case there is no water through which the effect is noticeable. Because gravity is weaker with distance, the Earth pulls on the moon a little more strongly on the side closest to the Earth than it does to the side further away, essentially stretching the moon towards the Earth. The part of the moon that was experiencing this stretching shifted as the moon spun, but this was always on a delay due to the sheer amount of time it takes for such a massive amount of solid rock to rise and fall. This meant that the tidal bulge was always a little out of alignment with the Earth, but was at the same time always being pulled towards that alignment by gravity. Over millions of years, the constant flexing of the moon in this way acted like a brake, dissipating some of its rotational energy as heat and slowing the moon's spin over time. Eventually, this slowed the moon's rotation to such a degree that it took the same amount of time to rotate on its axis as it did to complete its orbit. Once that happened, the gravitational bulge on the moon was no longer rotating away from the Earth, meaning that no more energy was lost to the movement of the bulge, ending the driving force behind that change of rotation and locking the moon into always having one side facing the Earth. Bringing all this back to Aquam Magna, if it were similarly tidally locked to Bara Magna, then the side facing away from the planet would never rotate towards it, meaning that any beings on that side of the ocean moon would never be able to see that other world. If the islands of Matanui and Voya were on the side of Aquam Magna that was facing away from Bara Magna, then it is perfectly reasonable for them to never know of its existence. This works for them never seeing Bota Magna too. If that jungle moon orbited closer to the planet than Aquam Magna does, then it too would also always be hidden from view. We even have some evidence for this being the case, with shots like this from the Matanui saga appearing to depict Bota Magna being closer to Bara Magna than Aquam Magna is. Of course, the 100,000-year timescale of the Bionicle storyline does not give nearly enough time for this tidal locking to have occurred naturally, so instead the resonance between Aquam Magna's spin and its orbital period would have to be put into place via other means, most likely as a result of the shattering itself. Given the role of energized protodermis in that cataclysmic event, perhaps we can say that the orbit of Aquam Magna was destined to be this way, and the destiny-based abilities of the energized protodermis made sure that it came into being. One interesting result of this particular orbit-to-spin resonance for Aquam Magna would be that the length of a day on that world would be the same as the length of its orbit around Bara Magna, just like how a lunar day is dictated by the time it takes for the moon to complete its orbit around the Earth. And, when you look at the evidence within Bionicle canon for the length of a day on Aquam Magna, this leads to some very interesting consequences. The length of a day on the original planet of Synchronous Magna before the shattering was 36 hours long. This fact was canonized by the suggestion of a fan to Greg Farshtey, after they noted that the great sundial seen in the Matanui Online game had 18 sections, denoting 18 hours of daylight and therefore 18 hours of night. I've done a whole video going into more detail on this in the past. The link is in the card above if you want to check it out. It was also further canonized that the great beings designed the day-night cycle of the Matoran universe to be the same as that of Synchronous Magna, 36 hours long. The length of a day on Aquam Magna has not been canonized in the same way. However, I think there is enough evidence here to say that it is actually also that same 36-hour length. Presumably, any sundials used by the Matoran on the island of Matanui would be calibrated to whatever day length they had on the island. They had no memories of their lives within the Matoran universe after all, so it would make no sense for them to have sundials that aligned to the length of a day there, especially if it was a different length of day to the one that they were experiencing. However, we know that the Great Sundial was aligned with the 36-hour days of the Matoran universe. And yet no one who sees it makes any reference to it having a different number of hours than they would expect. Nixie studied its design, and the only unusual things she notes are the marker at 4 o'clock and the fact that it was found underground. Surely, if it had a different number of hours than usual, she would have noted that too. Again, the real-world explanation of this, of course, is that the 36-hour day canonization came much later than the release of the Matanui Online game. However, in-universe, this seems to me like pretty strong evidence that the length of day on Aquam Magna is also 36 hours long. If this is the case, then given what we have already discussed, this means it would also take Aquam Magna 36 hours to complete one orbit of Bara Magna. If we take this, and assume that the length of a day on Bara Magna did not change as a result of the shattering, then that means that Aquam Magna has a very special type of orbit. If an object in orbit takes the same time to complete one orbit as the planet below takes to rotate once on its axis, this is known as a synchronous orbit. Synchronous orbits around the Earth, also known as geosynchronous orbits, are very useful orbits for certain types of satellites, as from the ground the satellite is always visible in the sky, never dipping below the horizon. If the orbit is aligned with the Earth's equator, then the satellite will appear from the ground to hang motionless in the sky, always in the same position. If it is not aligned with the equator, then it will appear to move, but in a strange northwards and southwards motion, often following a figure-of-8 path within the sky. This is usually hard to spot from the ground given how small artificial satellites are, but just imagine how this would look when applied to a whole moon. Although, as fun as this is to think about, that assumption that Bara Magna has retained its former 36-hour-long rotation is quite unlikely to be accurate. Given that earthquakes are known to produce small but still measurable changes to the rotation rate of the Earth, the same should certainly be true for such a cataclysmic event as the shattering. The magnitude 8.9 earthquake that hit Japan in March 2011 shortened the length of a day on Earth by a whole 1.8 microseconds by changing the distribution of the Earth's mass. An event such as the shattering, where whole sections of the planet split apart from one another, would produce orders of magnitude larger effects than this, meaning that the possibility of Bara Magna having the same rotation rate post-shattering as it did before are remote, to say the least. This means that while Aquam Magna would have an orbit lasting 36 hours, it would no longer be synchronous with that of the planet below, and so would appear to move across the sky in a more traditional way, rather than the strange stationary or figure-of-8 movements we discussed earlier. Before we close out this video, there is one more thing. When I was performing my research for this investigation, I found this post in the Greg archives from back in 2010, where the user suggested to Greg the exact same explanation for why the Matoran could not see Bara Magna. When I looked at the username of that person, I got a bit of a surprise. It was me! So, you could say that this particular video has been a whole 14 years in the making. What part of Bionicle lore do you want to see analysed next? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you again soon for another Bionicle Science investigation here at the Knowledge Tower.